And with that, we will hand it over to other Adam, Adam Wisniewski. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll hand it over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it. And Adam, I've had an opportunity to know Adam Heckman for, good gosh, probably 7 years now. And
long time.
Yeah, it's been phenomenal just to be in his presence. He has this infectious way of exciting people around not just technology, but civic good and giving back to the community through a myriad of different ways. So much appreciated for Michael and Adam inviting me to speak tonight. So I'm looking forward to it. All right. So with that said, I'm going to do a quick screen share, and you should be able to see my screen here in a second. All right. So tonight's topic is accelerating civic innovation through high impact design. This is a topic that I'm extremely passionate about. Not only am I heavily involved in civic innovation in Chicago, but it's something that I got exposed to as a kid early on in my life. Both of my parents were heavily involved in community give back, and they always inspired me to do more within the community. So speaking of inspiration, we've got three things that are the goals of tonight's session. The first of which is to inspire you, regardless of what your background is or what your education level is, or if this is your first time at Chi Hack Night, or you've been a seasoned, experienced person within the group. It's important that you take away from tonight's session some inspiration. How can I get involved? Where can I start? What can I do? Maybe you're somebody who's been in civic innovation for a while and just needs to rev up your engine again. The second area that we'd love for you to get out of this is some education. So we're going to be introducing a framework that I created called High Impact Design. And not only have I been using it for over a decade now with civic innovation, but also for just general innovation at large. And I think it's a strong kind of scalable framework. So I'll be showing you how I've used it, why it's important, and how you could use it as well, which leads to the third area of learning. It's around application. So how can you take that framework today and leave here, and even in some of the breakout sessions you have today, or even some of the things you may get started on tomorrow or next week, how can you take these lessons and actually apply them to very specific challenges that your neighborhood or community or city may be faced with? So a little bit of background. Some people call me Adam Wiz, just short for Wisniewski. I'm a designer and technologist. So if you are in design or you're in technology, I speak both of your languages. I've been a UX designer for over 20 years. I also am a software developer, so I write in multiple languages. Some of you may know me from some of the work that I've done with Microsoft. I've been awarded the Microsoft MVP for several years for my work in computer vision and some early applications that I built, including one of the first ever 3D holograms of Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech. My day-to-day role is leading a group of design thinkers and digital thinkers at EX3 Labs, the company that I founded in 2016, and I serve as the CEO. And we have the privilege of assisting some of the world's largest organizations and really digging deep on customer, workforce, and civic challenges, and really helping them explore ways that they could use design and technology for the greater good. So my background, for those of you that don't know me, I grew up in Evanston, and actually probably one of my first areas of civic innovation that I was probably most proud of is Penny Park Initiative. If you're from the Chicagoland area, you're very familiar with the Penny Park Initiative and how it started, but it was basically a group of some adults and some kids that got together to raise pennies. Everybody basically emptied their piggy bank full of pennies to create Penny Park, and that's how it got funded. And we were able to solicit over 1,500 volunteers. And I just remember as a kid, I was very, very young at the time, but I just remember breaking open my piggy bank, and the park was completely funded by pennies, which is just a great story. For those of you that are familiar with Penny Park and have followed it over the last decade or so, they actually just redid the park. It's one of the few parks in Illinois still that's completely made of wood, and it looks like a big tree house, which was a fantastic park to not just be part of from fundraising perspective, and kind of a crowdsourcing campaign perspective, but also just to use as a child. So in 2008, I helped to build one of the first ever digital media labs in a public library. And this wasn't a regular computer lab. This was a state-of-the-art equipped digital media lab that was used by the entire community, where you could check out high-end video recording and editing equipment. It had some green screen technology and all of the latest kind of Adobe Suite software. And this was for everybody, anybody who had a library card to come in, kind of check out some of this high-end equipment. And it was fascinating to see how some of those efforts that came from a very small grant by Elizabeth Colson could turn into something really amazing. And we were able to be a bellwether for a lot of other libraries that were looking to create impacts in their community. So I spent some of my time during my career while I was at public libraries doing speaking engagements and talking about how libraries can really help their communities by bringing these digital media labs and equipment into the library to help people start businesses. And you can imagine all the creative things that even children can do. So very exciting to be a part of that. I was fortunate enough early in my career to be attached to Code for America while I was a lead UX designer at the city of Chicago. The timing of it worked perfectly. I never worked for Code for America, but I worked with them on several really high profile projects, city service projects, some of which were around adopting a fire hydrant. And there was a crowdsourcing software that we built to help individuals shovel each other's sidewalks and basically volunteer to do that to help keep the city street safe, especially for elderly people who may not have had the dexterity or physical strength to shovel their own sidewalks. There's a lot of other scenarios in that. One of the first ever translation tools on the city sites to help translate all of the different services into over 50 different languages, we're really excited about. So my time there it kind of shaped the way I think about giving back and supporting coding for good. In addition to that, in 2016, I started the Immersive Learning Lab mission, which was an effort to basically bring immersive educational content and VR devices into Chicago public schools and schools really in need. And that was one of the first times I'd seen some really strong crowdsourcing efforts from nonprofits, corporations, and the startup realm kind of put together and in partnership with 1871, which is a local innovation hub within the city. And we've done 3 of these so far. It's been fantastic. We did one at Pullman Elementary and Daniel Boone on the north side. We also did one for Diet School of the Arts on the south side. So it's been exciting, and seeing the faces light up of the students as they experience content in a way they've never seen before. Of course, most recently, the MLK hologram I talked about, and then the My Shine, My Future application, which some of you may have heard, which connects youth with local programming and job opportunities. We were able to build a mobile app for the city, and we did it within a 3-month time period, which is somewhat unheard of for that level and sophistication of application. So we were excited about that, and the framework that we're getting set to share here with you today is very, very important to understand how we were able to do that with that level of speed. So but if we synthesize my background, I love digging deep on customer, workforce, and civic challenges, and really exploring ways to solve them using design and technology. So if you think about civic innovation, there's a lot of different definitions. The most broad term that we can think of as civic innovation is the practice of changing the way a society works, really at any level. So regardless if it's at the highest level on the policy side or anything related to legislation, or something related to something as simple as what happens within an individual neighborhood, any level can be thought of as civic innovation. Now, if you break down civic innovation in a couple different areas, you most classically can think about it as civic engagement, improving health and safety, and certainly infrastructure. There are a lot of other subcategories of this, civic engagement being one of the largest one, which has to do a lot with volunteerism. how you think about supporting your community from a time and voice perspective. How do you amplify different voices within the community to solicit change? And then, of course, health and safety, which we'll talk a little bit about, and then infrastructure. A lot of people feel like their area, their sweet spot of civic innovation is engagement, because they often associate improving health and safety and infrastructure with having to have a lot of money or a lot of connections. But the reality is, with the right idea and the right commitment and level of excitement, and you can spark a lot of change in a lot of different areas. So we'll hit on a mixture of each one of these tonight. So one of my favorite quotes is, "Service is the rent we pay for the space we occupy in this world." And I love saying that. It's not to guilt anybody into thinking about becoming a steward of their community, but it's really, if you think about the areas of impact that we can have, each one of us has the ability to make a difference in our city, in our community. But service is really the price that we pay for that space that we occupy. So we talked about high impact design. What does that actually mean? We'll go into a lot more depth on the next slides, but high impact design is a comprehensive framework that my company and I created, EXP Labs, in a process for answering critical business questions through collaborative strategy, ideation, and design. One of the things that I've been a huge fan of since the beginning of my career is design thinking. You all probably have heard that term a lot. Design thinking is a fantastic way to think about civic innovation at large, or testing ideas. One of the things that I found a bit of a challenge with design thinking is that while you start with empathy, one of the challenges with civic innovation is that in some cases, it doesn't just require input from, let's say, one customer, but you actually have to think about it from a holistic community. And how do different municipalities operate? You know, what's the governance behind a structure, whether it's something that's government related or neighborhood related? How do you think about all of the inputs? Because everybody has a different set of inputs. People have different goals, they have different initiatives, and it's really the mashup of all those inputs, not just one individual user of a product or service, to make sure that you can ensure your idea not only gets traction and commitment, but also has the ability to be tested and validated to the place where you have a confidence level that this is an idea that is worth pursuing. So we'll talk about the differences between design thinking, traditional design thinking, and high impact design. And if you don't have any background in design thinking, that's not a problem. We'll walk through it at a pace, and certainly there's some other materials that we can share after this that will help. So if you think about high impact design, it's an acronym that we'll talk about, but it leverages kind of three pillars or three structures, if you will. The first of which is human-centered and value-driven definition. Human-centered and value-driven definition. The second one is iterative and rapid delivery. And the third is continuous and data-driven evaluation. So those three: human-centered and value-driven definition, iterative and rapid delivery, and continuous and data-driven evaluation. So the acronym IMPACT stands for inputs, measurements, and then those all fall under the human-centered and value-driven definition. When we talk about iterative and rapid delivery, prototypes, also the P is used for pilots or proof of concepts in some cases, or projects. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a digital experience that you create, so it can scale to multiple different types of solutions. And then assessment. So those fall under iterative and rapid delivery, and under the continuous and data-driven evaluation, we have commitment and traction. One of the reasons why the C and the T are very, very important is because sometimes you can have all the great ideas, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they can go anywhere. And getting a level of commitment on civic innovation from partners or outside sources or institutions, or even family and friends, is super, super important. So even if your idea has the most amount of merit, you think it's the most amazing idea on the planet, it's going to solve X, Y, and Z, how do you ensure you can get commitment? And of course, traction. How do you, once you grow and expand, how do you make sure it continues to have a life beyond its own? So we'll start with each one of those, starting with human-centered, value-driven definition. So inputs, if you think about the I in impact, it stands for inputs, and it's really around observing, listening, and discussing. I don't think there's a better tool that you have to help solve problems than your eyes and in your ears. There are so many different ways to observe what you see in your neighborhood, in your city, in your community to help spark change. This story happens to be from a 13-year-old girl in Canada who noticed every time she went into a restroom that when kids used the hand dryers, mechanical hand dryers, they would put their hands over their ears. And every kid that she saw in the bathroom would do this. And in most cases, kids can react to certain things, and maybe in some cases they overreact to certain things. So as an adult, we're pretty oblivious to this. But one of the things that she found after she decided to pursue solving for this is that the average hand dryer's placement on a wall is lower to the ground, which means it's closer to children's ears. And after she did some studying, some research, she found out that these hand dryers were at a decibel level based on the placement on the walls for a lot of different hand dryers to the place where it was too high of a decibel level for the average child to endure. So she started doing some research, and you can see her doing some measurements and doing some decibel level reading just to understand how these can impact children. She ended up getting, I believe, a grant from Dyson, which is fantastic. And she made some national headlines based on this. But it all started with observing and listening, right? There wasn't any particular thought process she had around, I'm going to go into a bathroom and see if I can solve a problem. She saw this it repeated as an issue, and she was able to think about that and how it can incorporate it. And then, of course, we'll talk about the traction and the commitment. Observation takes on a ton of different pathways as well. And speaking of pathways, there's a concept called the desire path, I'm sure most of you are aware of. It's defined as something that's created as a consequence of erosion caused by human or animal traffic. So walking past, oftentimes you see these on college campuses where there's a designated walkway, but students and faculty cut through because it's the fastest path to get to their end destination. In fact, UIC has a series of these, this is from Google, satellite images that showcase how a series of pathways, these desired pathways have been created based on walkways, natural walkways that people have created. This is interesting because a lot of architects will use the desire pathway. In fact, this is a pretty common practice in South America for architects to prototype and test different urban planning settings to see what the desired path is before they actually lay pavement. And what a wonderful way to save on resources and time and construction and money. But there's a lot of ways to help individuals. But think about the implications that are not just for the average person. Think about accessibility, right? There's accessibility requirements and things that have to take place. So making sure that there is a fastest way from point A to point Z, and actually having those desired pathways not only identified and observed, but also communicating to whoever you need to around how do we make change on our areas to do this. One of my favorite stories around inputs is the Grandmother Park Initiative. And this is a good example of how ideas don't necessarily have to come from a problem that someone else experiences. I happen to know both of these women as I was familiar with them and some of their work, and they were also friends with my mom. My mother was a part of the Grandmother Park Initiative, and I remember she was telling me quite a bit about this and her excitement level. But Gay Rinesborough and Mary Trujillo actually were walking their grandsons in Dewey Darrow neighborhood of Evanston, and they ended up really being upset because there wasn't a park that was very close to them. They had to find themselves walking this incredible distance just to get to a park, not just any park, because if you have young children, you do not want them surrounded by 9 and 10-year-olds running around, or even 7-year-olds on equipment. You need some toddler park with the necessary equipment to do that. So they decided that they're just going to do something about it. And regardless of what the permit said, they found an empty lot. They were able to solicit some input and start crowdsourcing and getting their neighborhoods and the communities inspired and rallying behind this. And they were able to secure some funding from local companies and even the city themselves to build the newest grandmother park. So you can kind of see the before picture on the left. And believe it or not, this lot was actually sandwiched between two houses. So most people wouldn't think of, let's build a park between two houses. Who wants a park there? But the grandmother park, again, was meant for younger kids and is set up with both the equipment and the way the park is structured to be less noisy, but certainly impactful for the community. So moving on from so we know in inputs, you have to gather as much input as you can from all types of sources. So whether it's your own scratching your own itch and listening to your own inner voice around the problems you're experiencing, being able to observe some of the problems you see, we the equivalent of somebody putting over their ears in the bathroom, the children doing that around the hair dryers, to being able to just observe things, not just people, but desired path, things that are going on, using eyes and ears to determine the various areas of needs on the input side. In soliciting feedback is certainly part of that as well, but measurements is the next part of impact design. So the M in impact represents measurements. How do you prioritize and measure? Having a mechanism for new ideas to receive consideration, prioritization, et cetera. One of my friends who unfortunately was the victim of gun violence, his name is Andre. He lost the use of both of his legs and became paralyzed from the waist down. And overnight, his life changed. And this, if you're from, different cities, you understand that violence is one of those things that affects all of us, regardless if it impacts you directly in the immediate. These are all things that can completely turn a community upside down. One of the things that we were trying to relay around this was during Accessibility Awareness Month, we wanted to tell his story because the original story was around how challenging it can be, especially in certain apartments, based on how buildings were structured for someone who's in a wheelchair to do something as simple as reach for a plate on a cabinet, or in a cabinet or on a counter that's a little bit too high, or get through a door frame. And the incredible challenge that Andre had of just finding an apartment that was suitable was something that he struggled with. And with his permission, we actually were able to capture a day in the life with him, where we attached a 360 VR camera that captured his entire perspective, 360 degrees, to the back of his wheelchair. So as he went throughout his day, we were able to capture how difficult it was for him to get to the door frames, to reach for that plate that's on the counter that most of us take for granted, to navigate between different areas. And even it's tough to see in this space, but even the walkway here has a series of stairs right to the left of it that you can't see from the angle, but being able to just be challenged with getting around and navigating. We wanted to tell that story. So we created a VR experience where you get a chance to experience what it's like to go through a day within a wheelchair, 4+ hours to take a shower. Do you imagine that? Imagine 4+ hours just to get ready in the morning. This is something that people that have wheelchairs and have experienced other scenarios that have affected their mobility, that they deal with on a daily basis. But how do we, as people that can move and navigate freely, how do we empathize with that? And that was one of the things. So when we had this opportunity to do this with Andre, we had no idea, no clue that it was going to morph into something much bigger, which was not just creating awareness around accessibility, creating awareness around violence, creating awareness in general about even some of the challenges around housing, some of the challenges around prejudice and other scenarios. And we really were able to kind of open up a level of understanding around the accessibility community, which was fantastic. And Andre was such a great sport around the whole thing. He really wanted to help tell the story as well. Now, why is this in the measurements category? Well, if you have an idea, and even if you get inputs and you say, well, I think it's a good idea to tell this story because I want to get more people engaged around this problem, and I want to raise awareness around this problem. So let's create a technical experience that would help convey that story in a first person point of view. How do you know if it's going to be impactful? How do you know if it's going to reach the people that you need it to? And we'll talk about that a little bit in prototyping, but the measurement side of things is very important. If you have one idea, if you have multiple ideas, at Ixtria Labs, we use something called the impact versus feasibility matrix. And this is a way to plot. You'll see on the y-axis here, we have higher impact versus lower impact. On the x-axis, we have lower feasibility and higher feasibility. And you just plot in the different quadrants. How do you actually, your idea, where is your idea related to impact versus feasibility? Feasibility meaning, is this something that we feel like can be pulled off in a relatively lightweight fashion? Or is this really, really heavy and it's going to take a lot of effort? And it doesn't mean that it's impossible to go after. In fact, I would encourage you to think big and think about all of the challenges with that you can solve while you think big in really complex challenges. But it does ground you in, if I've got multiple ideas, which one should I be pursuing? I'm really passionate about giving back and helping the community. How do I measure these different ideas? Well, impact versus feasibility is a great way to do that. So you can see in the top right-hand corner, this one has the highest impact and potentially the highest feasibility. Of course, these are just placeholder contents, but you can superimpose whatever idea you're thinking about. And I would highly encourage you to think about who you can rally around different ideas and whether or not it's going to impact. So for us with Andre's story, it hit so many different areas: accessibility, housing in Chicago, gun violence. So for us, it was like a home run of different ways we can storytell and really impact the community. The other barometer, if it's just saying if it's not a hell yes, then if it's an F no. So that's another way so that you can govern a lot of those measurements by your instinct. And sometimes your instincts can really be spot on. So I would encourage you to say, listen, if you're really passionate about something, regardless of where it plots on the impact versus feasibility matrix, if you really are into it, pursue it with every passion that you have. Now, the other way that I particularly think of when I think about measurements is using data to help drive some of the measuring whether or not this is going to have impact. So it's a lot easier to measure impact in terms of where we are with Chicago based on the data portal. If you all have not gone to the data portal, I highly recommend that you scan the QR code. Most of you probably have seen it. It is a treasure trove of data associated with the city. Everything from parks and recreations to sanitation to buildings. I've been able to use the transportation quite a bit. In fact, it just created this pretty rich data visualization around CTA and how the pandemic has shifted ridership on CTA in both buses and trains. And part of what I do is I'll look through data and some of the open data through the data portal, and I'll figure out, does this help validate or help measure whether or not some of the ideas that I have an impact? So if you're thinking about something that could potentially affect education, it's worthwhile understanding the data behind education. How does the city structure it? How do they think about education? Buildings, anything from, historical preservation, all of these things can make a difference. And what I love about the Chicago data portal is that it continues to grow and grow over time. So the second area is iterative and rapid delivery. So if you think about iterative and rapid delivery, most of this is around prototyping and making sure that you can actually push forward things very quickly. Ideas come from a lot of different places, and you don't have to be perfect to solve different problems. This is an early version of the Bluetooth headset, of course, with the rubber band across the phone. So rapid prototyping and iterative prototyping or iterative design does not require you to be a designer. In fact, You can sketch something on a napkin and get your point across. The main thing is that you take the step to visualize what your solution brings to the table. Not all solutions are digital or technical. Some of them are more strategy based. Some of them are more kind of physical structure based. You can prototype those things in very lightweight tools using very lightweight tools. But again, highly recommend you using just a piece of paper and a dry erase marker, or a whiteboard and a dry erase marker to convey your point visually and really share that with others. The My Shine, My Future application that I mentioned, we used that process, a rapid prototyping and kind of an iterative model, and we got a lot of inputs. It wasn't just us designing. I served as the lead designer on the product, and I was able to support building out some of the mock-ups, and we had a phenomenal team that was supporting the project at large with multiple designers and multiple technologists and coders and delivery leads and business analysts. But the true magic with the My Shine, My Future mobile application came from a group of students that we used as a sounding board for features, and they actually helped build out some of the core features and act as a proxy to either the end user, or in some cases they served as the persona that we built the entire application around. So while you're prototyping, while you're thinking about inputs and measurements, it's important to keep the end user in mind as you're thinking through a solution. We have a saying, I actually have this on my t-shirt. So if a picture is worth 1,000 words, a prototype's worth 1,000 meetings. It's a saying we use a lot at EXU Labs. Certainly words we live by. It's a lot easier to communicate your idea through something visual. And a prototype certainly can save you a lot of time in meetings and back and forth with people. And what I love about Shy Hack Night is the fact that you all can go into breakout groups and to think through ideas and attention and collaboration into those ideas. It's phenomenal. Assessment's really important too. So there's another group, and there's various countries where you may have seen this in, but in an effort to get writers to slow down in different cities, there was a designer that put together it's an optical illusion. So you actually see the image here on the screen. It looks like there is a young girl that has a ball in the middle of the street, but it's actually a stretched out visualization that's on the concrete. So if you're close up to it, you can see that it's clearly drawn on the pavement. If you're really far back, it just looks like there's a girl in the street bouncing a ball, forcing people to slow down. And some cities have been certainly very nervous about releasing something like this, but some cities were willing to try it out. And one thing was true is that not only did writers slow down, but it actually pulled in a lot of attention to people in the community around the fact they should be abiding by speed laws, especially in school zones and things like that. So this was a great optical illusion, and there's a lot of different versions of this that you may have seen. But part of what you need to do when you release an idea, whether it's something like this or something more visual, first of all, this requires a lot of approval and things like that from the city. So I wouldn't encourage anybody drawing straight on the pavement in the middle of a busy street. But related to this, they got permission to do this. They released it. They spent a lot of time getting quantitative and qualitative feedback on it. Is this actually making a difference? Through observation. So once they put that prototype out there and they started testing it, they were able to go back to the stakeholder groups or the cities or the aldermen and say, listen, this is the result. This is what we're seeing. Is this something that we can push out on a more grand scale? And that's really what's really important about getting commitment on your idea, is using that assessment piece within high impact design, that after you prototype, to actually go through a series of tests to make sure you can quantify whether or not this is going to make a difference. It's super important to be able to drive your storytelling with the solutions that you're building with numbers. So it brings me to my third point. So continuous and data-driven evaluation. These require two things: commitment, and I'm going to kind of speed through this just so we can move to Q&A here in a second. Commitment, which is obtaining the necessary resources to ensure that your project can continue to iterative and go through a validation process. and then traction, which is ensuring your idea is expanding and growing. So oftentimes you need to get a certain level of commitment. And this is one of the main differences that we see with something like a traditional design thinking, which kind of gets you through the testing cycle, to when I need to crowdsource an idea or get funding behind it or get other people to buy into the idea. How do I ensure that I can get commitment from different people and get traction as well? And the numbers that you tell during the assessment phase based on the research that you gather are really going to help with that. So Les Brown has a really great quote: "Until the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of change, you'll never change." Another way to say that is it's got to hurt bad enough for people to really evoke change in their community. And I hope that this talk not only sparks a level of inspiration to help you get started, to know that you can make a difference regardless of what your background is, to your community, to your neighborhood, to your city. It is important that those pains, that you think through those pains. What are other people experiencing? What are you personally experiencing? What is your community at large experiencing? And hopefully it's not to the point where it's so bad that you're sparking change within yourself, but hopefully if you're paying attention enough and you're observing and you're listening, that you can identify that pain earlier on to move forward. So it takes a great deal of desire and commitment and motivation. So again, just a quick recap: high impact design is a framework that has 3 pillars: human-centered and value-driven definition, iterative and rapid delivery, continuous and data-driven evaluation. The impact is an acronym for inputs, measurements, prototypes, pilots, projects, and proof of concepts. Assessment, commitment, and traction. You need all of these areas in order to really evoke change within your community. A few books that are good reads. Certainly can socialize these after the fact: Innovator Solution, Creative Confidence, Lean Startup, and The Small Big. One of my favorites is The Small Big. For those of you that want to stay in touch, feel free to reach out to me. I'm at Adam Wiz on the social media handles. We also have a new state-of-the-art digital suite that we just opened up at 1871 at the Merchandise Mart. Highly encourage you to reach out. We do tours on a regular basis. It has some state-of-the-art technology and has some of the CTA data visualizations that we had talked about. It was my pleasure being here today. And at this time, we're going to open up for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you, Adam.
Yeah, and as Adam mentioned, we'll move into the Q&A portion. So if you do have any questions, please type them in the chat feature of YouTube Live, and other Adam and me, Big Adam and me, will get to them. So I guess in terms of the first question, speaking of getting in touch with EX3 Labs and whatnot, a question from the audience is, are you hiring? And if so, how do people apply?
We are hiring. We've been on a kind of an interview spree over the last few weeks, but definitely you can reach out to hello@ex3labs.com. Feel free to send your resume, etc. Typically, we hire all types of different roles, but you can certainly visit our website if you're interested in finding out what roles specifically we have available. And we're happy to meet anybody that's interested in being an impact and difference maker.
Nothing says you did a great job like somebody, like the first question being, are you hiring? Another question from the audience, does the data portal, and I assume that means the city data portal, does the data portal include information showing use of the My Shine, My Future app? Actually, I don't think it's on the data portal, but I know it's on one of the city.
So what's actually interesting, Adam, is the programming and events and that API data that gets fed into the application. They do have some programming feeds directly on the data portal. So I definitely recommend going to the data portal. You can either search youth programming or My Shine, My Future. Both of those will net you some results that would get you access to programming.
Fabulous, thank you.
But I highly encourage you downloading the My Shine, My Future app. That's the best way to do it.
Yeah. Michael, you want to take the next one?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so the next question is, what are some of the main differences between the high impact design versus other more traditional design practices? I know you did mention at one point, particularly with the traction, some of the differences there with kind of more traditional. I guess, can you speak to some of the other differences you see between kind of high impact design and more traditional practices?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about a lot of what we've seen within large, either municipalities or city organizations or nonprofits, and in some cases, large organizations, is funding becomes a huge challenge. And a lot of it has to do with prioritization. So every time you have an idea that you think is amazing, there's probably a half a dozen to a dozen ideas that other people think are amazing that are probably competing for everything from the funding sources to the time commitments to the resources behind the scenes necessary to help that idea grow and be seeded. So how do you figure out which one to go after? And we saw too many organizations that were using things like design thinking and agile practices to create ideas in a very short time period and use those tools to test some of the ideas, but it was still falling short. So the commitment and traction piece is really very important, especially when it comes to understanding how to rally support around an idea and paying very special attention to it, because there are a lot of mediocre ideas that get a lot of traction, or even bad ideas, quite frankly, that get traction and commitment based on the fact that they thought of that, not just to begin with, but they structured the format around even how they presented it to stakeholders based on having a very specific plan. So commitment and traction are probably the biggest differences. On the front end, it has to do with the input. So typically within what we see a lot of times with design thinking is that there's this kind of one persona that you're designing for, and you're doing everything that you possibly can to get inputs from that particular person or user, which is fine. In some cases in design thinking, you're getting inputs from a lot of users. But what high impact design does is it thinks about inputs in a very different way. It thinks about upfront inputs that help synthesize all of the different groups that potentially benefit from something like the solution that you're creating. So a good example from my Shine My Future application is because that application is built for youth, you could center around what you think of as the main user as somebody between ages 11 and 17. The reality is, while My Shine My Future is built for youth, there are a lot of parents that use it to help their children find different opportunities and programs. And there's a lot of teachers that use it to help their students find the same things. So we need to accommodate for a lot of different user groups. It's not just one pathway that we need to develop inputs in, not to mention the city at large in terms of what are the other large programming initiatives that they have that are specific to a goal. So inputs play a huge role in that.
That's really interesting, expanding the universe of who the sources are of those inputs. Really interesting. You have another question from the audience, and this is a question that I get from my clients quite a bit. Do you have any general insights on selecting the right metrics for evaluation and balancing the quantitative and qualitative measures?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, usually, in the traditional kind of business sense, you think about it from either productivity gains, efficiency gains, risk reduction, things like that. In a civic innovation scenario, it's actually quite different, but it's still on the same vein. If you think about, I'll just take, for example, one of the areas around civic engagement is people using the parks more. And if you were to correlate weather data with, you all probably have heard of Movies in the Park, which is fantastic. It feels like this has been an unusually rainy summer for us. But say someone is very interested. A lot of people put efforts in Movies in the Park. You got to set up projectors. You got to promote it. And if it rains, they're done. They either get rescheduled or they don't exist. So if you were to think about, you've got weather inputs, you've got how many people are actually attending Movies in the Park, and you cross-reference that data to figure out whether or not that's going to be impactful. all of those data points matter in terms of measurement. To make true impact, though, typically it's a cost reduction. Typically in municipalities, we think about health and safety standards being improved, or violence reduction, civic engagement, where there's more people doing something or becoming more aware of something, being able to prevent something, more of a preventative measure. So depending on what your solutions are, all those descriptors you can use, but it's important to kind of have a scale measurement to say, all right, if my solution is going to help with civic engagement to get more people around this particular area, whether it's promoting movies in park by having an alternative when it rains, or even creating a partnership, let's say, some streaming partner to actually do some type of kind of crowdsourced watch together scenario. Those types of things need to be measured on a scale that's relatable for all parties.
Michael, I think you had some questions.
I did have a couple, but I do want to be mindful of time as well. I think we are just at about 8 o'clock here. So that it's totally fine that we don't get to my questions. But yeah, thanks again so much for joining us, Adam. And I think going on the YouTube live chat in just a minute should be the link to our post live stream Zoom call that everybody can join, where we will again do 3-word introductions. We'll have a few more announcements, and then we'll move into the breakout portion of the evening again. And with that, we will all join in our usual farewell, where we all say together, "Go forth and hack" on the count of 3.
Oh, sorry. Count.
We'll do it again on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3.
Go
Go forth
forth
and hack.